Just need to share.
This line's like, there we go.
All right, so today we're going to go through self-studying ancient languages. So what this means is, what does it look like to learn a language from scratch without the support of a school? This presentation will take about 30 to 40 minutes, and we want to leave quite a bit of space for Q&A at the end, because that way we can actually help with any queries. So if we can move on to talk a bit about our background,
Wonderful.
Marie. So I started Latin when I was 13 as a homeschooler. I studied it on and off until about GCSE formally with somebody's help, and then afterwards I mostly self-studied. I got an A star for GCSE Latin, moved on to do AP Latin where I got a 5, and because A level Latin wasn't available in Hong Kong as an exam, I studied it. I studied the syllabus from afar, and got a mock at A star. As for my Greek experience, I started studying it when I was about 16 and got a 93% on the NGE about a year later. Right now, I'm studying classics at Durham University, been taking a lot of language modules, and I'm on track to get a first. For my secondary school experience, a lot of it's owed to the Institute for Classics Education, because it helped me immensely with my understanding of Homeric epic. And when I was doing A-level classical civilization, if it were not for Irini's help, I would not have done well on that exam. But with her help, I managed to pull off an A star and the top mark in the world, despite having about a month to do the exam content. Handing over to Marie.
Yeah, so my background's actually pretty different, although formally I haven't really done that much on paper before university. So I first started trying to learn Latin. I actually had a very comical aborted attempt when I was 6 years old. I just got really interested in both Greek and Latin. That failed. I shall attribute it to being six. Then again at 10 with a group of other homeschoolers. Um, Again, I think this was with the Lingua Latina textbooks, but we didn't get very far. And then when I was 15, I tried studying it just fully on my own, this time using the Oxford Latin course. And I studied to a point where I was given a mock A star for GCSE Latin, but then I had to take a break because I couldn't actually do any of the GCSEs or A levels for Latin or for classics. So at that time, I was also taking the Iliad and Odyssey courses with Irini, and that was sort of my moment of sanity while doing a lot of maths exams. Um, so now I'm doing classical civilization at Leeds, taking every language module there is available. I wish there were more. And similarly, also averaging firsts across my classes. Yeah.
So, we're going to talk a bit about ways to address language learning, and first and foremost is basic grammar terminology.
I think especially for native English speakers, it's very easy to just, you grow up, you speak a language, you don't really think about how it works. But I found, especially with ancient languages, there is no such thing as a native speaker. So it is really helpful to learn a language from rules first. So if you already know basic grammar terms in English, that will help you a lot. I think that was one of the things that really hindered me when I was 10 years old trying to go for Lingua Latina. I just didn't have any framework in my head. Whereas when I was 15, I went for it more systematically. And at that point, I also knew English grammar, which I hadn't touched when I was younger. And that really helped me get a better handle on that. And you don't need to be really good at grammar. I was not, but just knowing the terminology will make the textbooks fully accessible.
So, we're going to move on to note-taking strategies. One thing I'd add to the idea about grammar is there are textbooks for people who are approaching Latin and Greek from just English. There are textbooks called English Grammar for the Latinist and English Grammar for the Greek student. We've attached all of this to our bibliography, which will be at the very end, and we can send links to anybody. Moving on to note-taking strategies. One unorthodox strategy I've always had is a grammar parsing system. If we could move to the next slide, please. This is called the system, and this is basically my secret weapon to getting Latin and Greek sorted out. I so if I can talk about my university experience a little bit. In our first year, we had a lot of unseen text that we had to do. With the help of my annotation system, I was able to get most of this done within about 5 to 10 minutes. So, in one extreme case, I was able to be done with the passage by the time the person next to me finished sentence one. This is really helpful because it lets you understand the grammar at one glance, and it can help you keep your train of thought much later. So this differentiates by case, and as I've been doing with my own Latin tutoring students, I can distinguish by tense by using color. This applies to Greek as well, as you can see in the next slide, where I did it by hand. And so this is Euripides' Iphigenia Tauris. I had this in my Greek class the other year. So this is just set up for revision later. You'll notice how here I've got a little bit of interlinear on the top where I write down what each word literally means, and the grammatical relationships are in the green lines. So if it works for both languages, super useful, highly recommend trying to figure out a system like this. And my next suggestion is, so this is also what it looks like if you do it slightly more loosely. If you go to the previous one, here's some Latin from my previous year where I just prepare for class using pencil. Second piece of advice is to do regular grammar charts. So basically everything you need to know for Greek and Latin are these rules. And it really helps to have it firmly in your mind. And I like to do it by just blurting it out. I did this one a couple hours before my AP Latin exam, where I tried to get down everything you need to know for Latin on one A4. It's fiddly, you don't need to have perfect handwriting, but this is good to do every so often. And I made sure to do this as I was learning Greek. So the next slide demonstrates week 7 of Greek at my university, where this is just everything you need to know. This is helpful to do after each chapter as you study and after each major milestone you pass in each language. Even if it seems simple to repeat like knowledge from week 1, it just keeps it fresh in your brain, keeps you and forces you to do it. I recommend not doing this digitally. Doing it by hand will help you significantly with just your memory. And if we could move on to the next slide, flashcards are also immensely helpful for this. These are for vocab, but you can also do these for long sentences for passages, as I was told to do for AP Latin at one point. Okay. Next question is one that we get quite often. What sort of textbook do you go for? The grammar translation stuff or comprehensible input? Now, comprehensible input has had a huge resurgence over previous years. So you'll hear about this from like Lingua Latina per se illustrata, and it's also known as like Living Latin. While it's popular, I would generally recommend steering clear of these if you are self-studying, because it requires and kind of guesses more of a Latin ability that you've got from the start that you don't have. The grammar translation method builds you up from the start, and it is designed by the textbook to get you to where you need to be within a year or two. So if you want things that are better scaffolded, go for a grammar translation method. Comprehensible input has its benefits and has its reasons, but if you're doing a self-study course or if you're a homeschooler, the resources are just insufficient for you. This is something to do much later when you're trying to get better at it, but not for a foundation. Um, and finally, if you're going to go for actual text, look for academic versions of the text and one that includes a commentary. Iris and Phillips are the best for an intermediate user, so it's got a lot of context at the bottom. And you can also look at a lobe for just the translation on the side, but that's not going to help you with context. Handing back to Marie.
All right. Don't mind me if I'm coughing. I lost my voice yesterday and it's about half back. But when it comes to Koine Greek or Attic Greek or ecclesiastical or classical Latin, I would generally always advise go for the older one. So go for Koine Greek, sorry, go for Attic Greek over Koine Greek and learn classical before you learn ecclesiastical. Because I think it's much easier to go from Attic to Koine. So if you're generally interested in Greek, essentially start with the harder one first, and then it'll be quite easy for you to jump over and look at the later form of the language. If you're only interested in, say, reading New Testament Greek, then obviously just directly study Koine, and there's a lot of great resources for it. But if you're interested in Greek generally, I would say go for the older one first. So, like, my dad did Koine Greek. I can read his stuff, but he can't read my stuff. So it's just always going to be easier to bridge from one to the other when you're moving down in time. And similarly, when it comes to classical and ecclesiastical Latin, um, if you learn classical Latin first, you're learning the traditional set of rules essentially. And then when you're looking at later Latin, it's generally going to be quite consciously playing off of that. And if you know the original thing that it's deviating from, then you're going to understand it a lot better and you're going to have far much more versatility and range in what you can read. So classical will generally make it easier for you to continue your studies. And then which in terms of which language to learn first, if you want to learn both, I would suggest going for Latin first. So, learning Latin first, you're going to familiarize yourself with the grammar system, and with every language, there's going to be its own challenges. But something that's nice about starting with Latin is you don't have to worry about learning a new alphabet. So, I don't think learning a new alphabet is particularly hard, but it does remove a lot of that sort of mental block at the start when you're looking at a page of letters and it doesn't make sense. And the other really nice thing about learning Latin first is that there's simply a lot more resources for learning Latin. There's a lot more online resources, especially when it comes to, say, online dictionaries. Latin has more user-friendly options, I would say, that just run a little bit smoother than the Greek equivalents. And I would say you have a better range of textbooks to pick from for Latin. Um, but again, sort of like with Koine, if you only want to read Greek, just go directly, learn Greek. Um, One thing that is perhaps not particularly important, but worth noting, is a lot of Greek textbooks assume you've already studied Latin. So they'll very frequently make reference to, oh, this is similar to when Latin does this. You can just skip past those sections on Latin. If it's a decent textbook, it'll be explaining it without using Latin grammar. But Latin grammar does get mentioned as a comparative very often. So if you do already know Latin, it can be helpful. And if you don't, it's a bit distracting. And yeah, when it comes to how much time you should be expecting to spend, I think even like, say, half an hour a day will get you very far. But the main thing is really consistency, because if you're just doing a little bit each day, like say 10 minutes a day, it's going to stick in your head much better than if you're doing a 4 hour session once a month. That's if you do like one long, intense session every now and then, it'll also feel a lot less sustainable. So just go for what fits into your schedule. If you're trying to work quite intensely up to a higher level, I would say even an hour a day will get you quite far. I think I went through most of the Oxford Latin course in about 3 months, spending, I would say, 2 to 3 hours a day. And keep in mind that that's usually done over the course of 3 years. But if you spend an hour a day, you can do what would usually be a year's course in a month. And I do not have a good memory, but when you're doing it every day, it stays fresh in your mind. And if you've already done a bit before, just doing a little bit every day is also really helpful for keeping vocabulary in your head, even if you're not picking up as many new concepts. Just even maintaining current levels is, I think, a little bit underrated when it comes to language learning. And yeah,
All right, so
I think that
now we're going to
covers
divide this into two parts, one specific Latin guidance and a specific Greek guidance. So if we can go to the next slide, Latin has a lot of textbooks. Cambridge Latin course is about the most common one you'll see. But me and Marie are huge advocates of the Oxford Latin course. Now, you can't go wrong with either one of them, really. Cambridge Latin course is brilliant because it's got a ton of free online resources and it's very commonly used, so you'll get Quizlet help online, etc. But the Oxford Latin course, from our experience, is a lot more systematic with grammar. It doesn't expect as much out of you to start with. It doesn't have any unexpected leaps. And in my opinion, it does the best grounding work to get you acquainted with the Roman world. So this follows the life of Quintus Horatius Flaccus, Horace the poet, and throughout Horace's life, explained through the textbook, it grounds you in Republican Roman history, and especially in Book 3, gives you a very solid introduction to Latin verse. So it'll give you unadapted bits of Horace himself and some other poets. In my experience, this is really good to teach younger students with, as I've been doing recently. With my 11-year-old student, he's been having a really good time with the stories, and it's no less boring than CLC because OLC can have a reputation of being a bit more dull in comparison. No dogs die, but it is still a good story. The other thing I noticed about CLC versus OLC is if you want to go down a CLC route, you might have to supplement it with extra grammar information because it's not as good with it. And with OLC, well, with both textbooks really, make sure that if you're doing it with a homeschooler, to have the teacher copy. So you've got the answers, and if you get stuck, you can refer to that. The teacher copy also has advice on how to teach the lessons if you're not just purely going at your if you're going purely at your own, it's a good idea to look through that as well. Next slide in dictionaries, I think.
right. So with dictionaries for Latin, there's essentially free versions of this online. The app version, very handy if you're working offline, but you can also just use the web version. I would I would say that iWords is probably what I use most regularly. Um, but I do also use physical dictionaries just as much as I do online. So online is nicest for just complete convenience, speed. But if you look at these physical dictionaries, when I'm forced to actually look through the pages for a word, I'm a bit more likely to remember it. But there's a couple of other things. The Pocket Dictionary, I'm a big fan of it. It actually fits in my pockets. Absolute win. So if I'm traveling and I don't have my computer with me, then it's a great way for me to work on a bit of translation. If you want the absolute mammoth of a physical dictionary, that is the Oxford Latin Dictionary, it's really worthwhile if you're looking at stuff in super close detail because it will give you more definitions and more archaic uses of a word and those sort of things that you won't be finding in the smaller dictionaries or the online dictionaries as easily. So that's just always going to be the most comprehensive version. And unfortunately, it's not fully digitized uh, into an app form, although I really wish it was. And then for grammars, so these grammars will contain all the information on the different concepts. So, like, say there'll be a page or so explaining the different types of subjunctives and what their forms are. This is really useful reference if you've learned a concept before and you can't remember what it was, or you're struggling to understand a textbook's explanation and want to see it in a different form. Again, there's a bit of a range of how comprehensive or not these are. I would say if you're a new student, the Cambridge Latin grammar is the most user-friendly. It will cover most of the core concepts that you'll be picking up from a textbook. Obviously, it will match everything in the Cambridge Latin course, but generally, I've found it quite useful if you want just a quick overview of a grammatical concept. If you want something that really goes into detail, Gildersleeves is very comprehensive. However, it's almost a little too comprehensive. So if you're not looking for the sort of full explanation of every single possible way a dative can or cannot go, I would say stick to something like the Oxford Latin Grammar, which is on the right, the blue one, or the Cambridge Latin Grammar. That will get you through most of the time. If you're like writing a commentary on a passage and a word just really doesn't make sense in its grammatical form, then consult Gildersleeves in case of emergency. But I will say it's not the most user-friendly, just in that the language it uses is perhaps unnecessarily dense at many points.
If I may add something to the Gildersleeves, I would say that it is like the OLD, something you will need eventually if you take Latin to a further if you take Latin far enough, because there will be mysterious uses of the subjunctive that you will not get. And unless you have Gildersleeves, you will not understand it. For instance, in Caesar, there's something called the subjunctive referring to an action as prospective action from the perspective of retrospection of something done in retrospective. It only works when it's in a military setting, when someone's about to do something that has already happened. It will not turn up in any other case, but unless you have Gildersleeve, you will not notice.
So
And if we go
my
to the
my
next slide,
concluding my concluding comment on both the dictionaries and the grammars is with the Oxford Latin Dictionary and Gildersleeves, you're only going to need them about 1% of the time in any given Latin passage, and they'll be really useful for that 1% of the time. But if you're not really fussed about something that's 1% of the time, just stick to the smaller things and they'll get you pretty much everywhere.
all right, the next bit of advice we have is for the Perseus Digital Library. This is really helpful for getting Latin texts off the internet for you to go through and format as you wish. Now, a lot of people will use Perseus as a parser, and for Latin, do not do this. It will not get you the answers you need to the extent you want. It will probably lead you in the wrong direction. It will have translations that are out of date. Only use this as a way to get the text. Anything else, exercise extreme caution. Just don't. This is a lot easier to do with Greek because Greek is both simpler and harder than Latin. In this respect, it is easier to use parsing tools for Greek than Latin. Just don't even try for Latin. And if we move on to Greek now, I think we just say that both of us have had more experience of Greek at university than as homeschoolers. I taught myself from when I was 16, but this was on about like I think 3 hours a week. And I had all of those gaps really filled in while I was at university.
Right. So Greek, officially I started at university. I did have an aborted attempt at age 6, which was how I learned the alphabet song in Greek, which I rate above the English one, by the way. But speaking of the alphabet, I would say the easiest way to just quickly get to know the alphabet in Greek is use it to write things in English. So write an English word, but just use the closest equivalent of Greek letters for it. I would say if you have someone else who's wanting to study Greek, if you text them on your phone keyboard, that means you can easily switch between Greek and English to check different letters and those sort of things. But when you're typing the letters, it just makes it easier to use them, and you'll be quite quickly reminded of what they are. When you can't remember a letter, you can probably guess from other ones you remember, since it's an English word you already know. So the way both Hillary and I got really comfortable very quickly with the Greek alphabet was texting each other using the Greek alphabet, but mostly in English. The other thing about the alphabet, though, is when you're typing in Greek, you will need specifically the polytonic Greek keyboard. If you just go into settings on your MacBook or desktop and go into keyboards, you'll probably see multiple options for Greek keyboards to download, and one of them should be called polytonic. So you can see that there's the keys highlighted in orange Those are the accents or diacritics or different aspirations that will go above the letters. And that is actually crucial. That can completely change a couple of fairly common but small words. So you do want to have specifically the polytonic keyboard. Otherwise, you can be mixing things up.
If I may add something quickly, macrons in Latin are optional. They are completely optional. Do not apply the same idea to Greek. You cannot do without the accents. At university, when we're submitting our exams, we must use breathings. Accents are highly recommended, but we're not like punished if we don't use them. Do not like I went off some really bad advice when I was learning Greek. I was told that accent marks are silly. Do not pay attention to them. Do not make the mistake I did. They are important.
The breathings especially. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similarly for me at university, you have to write the breathings or you will be penalized. But for accents, they're sort of please do it, but we won't, deduct marks if you get an accent wrong, since those tend not to change as much as the briefings do. And on to textbooks.
All right, so textbooks, you've got three big options. In the UK now, especially, John Taylor is the main option. However, I think that you'd be much better off going for Afanazi or reading Greek. Greek to GCSE is really good if you're in a school. And as we'll talk later, there's an accreditation that is quite well mapped to John Taylor's version. However, the chapters are probably excessively long. I taught myself initially using Greek to GCSE. It's very good at drilling the grammar into your head, but I feel like it doesn't really build your Greek skills. My university used Reading Greek, which is really helpful for a homeschooler because it comes in free books. It has a text and vocabulary, it has the grammar exercises, and it has an independent study guide, which means you can actually do it on your own. So I highly recommend it. A lot of the universities use Greek to GCSE, use Reading Greek. I know some use Greek to GCSE, but I think it's a good idea to steer clear of that.
Oh, just
Afinazi.
one note about Greek to GCSE is if you do happen to be using Greek to GCSE for whatever reason and you want the answer key but you don't have it, just email John Taylor and he will send it to you. I'm definitely not speaking from experience.
Or rather email the publisher. Just, spare the poor man. I emailed the publisher. They're really, when I was trying to do it myself, they're really helpful. They know people are trying to get the answer key. You just need to say that you're a homeschooler and they'll happily give you everything you need. Affinasi is your third main option, bit more old-fashioned. It's brought to you by the same guys who did the Oxford Latin course, so I'm a huge fan. It is, however, a bit harder to find, and I know some people online really recommend the Italian version of Affinasi. So that's a worthwhile option if you decide to be a bit more unorthodox. And if we go to the next slide, please. Dictionaries. Logéon is your best choice. It's really useful. Wiktionary is what every university student uses, but proceed with extreme caution. It will not tell you when it's Attic Greek versus modern Greek. I have heard my lecturers complain about people submitting modern Greek aorists on exams. Do not be that person. So you can use Wiktionary. It can give you a lot of it can give you the charts as you need it, but just read. Just don't get the wrong thing. Logéon will give you purely classical Greek. The Pocket Oxford and Little Scott are good for physical copies, and these two are already imported into Logéon, so that is your best option. Next slide, please. As for grammars, there's the Smythe, the Oxford Grammar, and the Cambridge Grammar. The Cambridge Grammar is new, so it's the most up-to-date, extremely detailed. However, most old grammars will still refer to Smythe as your main one. Having read all three of them, I think Smythe isn't that unreadable. It is probably worth just getting that off the bat. Some of the terms are a bit weird, but you will be fine as long as you are sensible with it. And next, so moving on to Marie with next steps.
All right, so if you're wanting to study classics at university, I would say in the UK, for example, which is where both Hillary and I are studying at the moment, there's a split between two kinds of classics programs. So I'm on a classical civilization degree, and Hillary's on a classics degree. And the difference here is that in my degree, you can start both language and Greek from beginner, both languages, Latin and Greek from beginner. But for a classics degree, they will usually, with three exceptions, usually it requires you to have taken some Latin or some other language before. But the real difference is in a classics program, the Latin and Greek modules are mandatory, whereas in a classical civilization or classical studies program, the language modules are optional. So you can choose whether or not you want to take them, and they're treated the same as, say, the ancient history and other literature courses taught in translation.
If I may
So
just recommend my own university quickly, the University of Durham is one of the few classics degrees that allow you to do both languages from scratch. So you can come in with some language experience in like modern languages and still be able to be on a classics degree.
that being said, if you happen to be already at the age where you're applying to university and you don't have accreditation, you can do a classical civilization or classical studies degree and simply take all the language options, which is what I'm doing since I wasn't able to take the exams before applying to university. Um, so say in the UK, usually what they require is GCSE Latin. There's also A-level Latin as well. Excellent if you have that. I'm very jealous if you got to do that at school.
Next
Um,
slide.
oh yeah. Uh, you can also take GCSE Latin as an international exam, but A-level Latin is not offered internationally at all, with the exception of apparently one school in Dubai, which is fascinating. Um, and then some other more international exam options are, say, National Latin exam. So that's usually an exam you take online. You can take it anywhere. It's based in America. And I would say, as a form of accreditation, it's nice to have, but because it's not like an in-person exam, which is carefully invigilated, it won't be treated as concrete a form of accreditation as other exams which you sit in person. So that's important to keep in mind. Um, AP for the American system used to
If I
be you
may
could take
take
it as
over
a
here.
homeschooler.
If I may take over here, I did this as a homeschooler in 2022. Back then, it was possible to do it entirely independently. Now, this from this year on, there's been something called a course project introduced to the AP course. I have emailed the AP College Board to see if this is still possible to access as a homeschooler because this project is hypothetically available only through AP Classroom. They've not responded to me yet, but if it is as the syllabus suggests, this may not be a valid option going forward. So I would recommend taking the NLE at its highest level, which is the advanced reading comprehension, and it is genuinely about equivalent to an AP in terms of difficulty. So proceed with caution here. It is best to email universities to see what they want. And if all else fails, it is also helpful to do the Cambridge Distance Learning Project for A-level Latin, which is what I did, where you can still get someone to mark your A-level work, but you will not be able to have an accreditation. It will give you an assurance that you're at that level, but you will need to find an alternative way to get the matriculation exam for university. And of course, there's the IB, but you need to be part of the IBDP. So this is good if you are in an IB school and want to do Latin on the side, not that helpful if you're a homeschooler.
Yeah. Also, a side note, even just on taking GCSE and A-level Latin in the UK, if, say, you're at a school which doesn't offer it, you can take it as a private candidate. The issue there is that centers that take private candidates tend to charge quite a bit more than the exam itself costs. Some of them don't actually charge that much more, but some of them do raise it quite a lot. Um, but the examination board has a website where you can check which centers offer which subjects and also whether or not they take private candidates. So that's very useful if, like me, you're looking to do a Latin exam privately, which I did this year, did A-level Latin. And then for
Right.
Greek,
If I may handle the Greek part, Greek, you have much fewer options. For Latin, you can at least have the IGCSE, which is available anywhere in May or June. For Greek, you only have these options in England for both GCSE and A level. There's the National Greek exam, which is about equivalent to the NLE, and I think it can be used if you ask a university correctly because it does have Homer exams. So it will test you on Iliad and Odyssey in the original. So it does have that sort of rigor that is required. The IB is also available for Greek, same problem as with Latin. But the most important thing to note is the intermediate Greek certificate, which a lot of universities in the UK have promised to recognize as an accreditation. It is not going to be considered like a full A level or a full AP, but they will recognize it as your Greek ability. This tests the content of John Taylor chapters 1 through 6. As you will note earlier, I did say that it can be very useful, but I think you can get around it by looking at what's on the syllabus and matching that with your own private studies elsewhere. So, Greek, much fewer options. If you really want to take Greek instantly at university at like an intermediate level instead of beginners, you will have to negotiate with a university and you will probably not get very far with this. And finally, accreditations for classical civilization. Um, there's an international version of this, and my biggest warning is it is an October and November exam. We found this out in September when we thought it would be a May or June exam, which is why I somehow ended up with about 3 weeks to do a full A level. Back to Marie for the rest of the explanation.
right, so basically a while ago in the UK, a lot of people were like, hmm, if we've got these exams where you have to be at a fancy enough school where you're taking Latin, then no one's going to study classics anymore. So they came up with the idea of studying classics in translation. So reading, say, Homer or the Aeneid or ancient history texts in English and studying the content, studying the context, all of that. So you can get that at GCSE or A level, and it's also available internationally. I do rate these quite highly. Obviously, I didn't take it myself. I did maths and further maths. It's two of my A levels. A little bit sad. Um, but I spent a while doing work experience in a sixth form lately in the UK, observing a lot of their classical civilization lessons, and I can quite confidently say that it's genuinely a fun syllabus, and I do think a lot of that context, if you're studying the language important, I think that's really crucial. But if you're wanting to study classics generally as well, and you're interested in the time period and the culture, but you don't say have the time to fit in the language, or you want to do this as well as the language, these are genuinely really great options and a really great way to explore if you're more interested in classics and taking it at an even higher level.
Um, So our final piece is how do you bridge the gap between a textbook and actual texts? Because this is a question that I've heard a lot, particularly in the Classics Association I attend in Hong Kong. Um, our advice for this is in Latin, there are some readers you can use to bridge that gap. There's Latin through Ovid, which is a textbook series that you can just go through the final few chapters where it goes through unadapted Ovid. Or there's the novella called Ad Alpes, which does a very good job at taking you from the end of a school textbook to about the same standard as your normal Latin texts. But if you don't want to do that, or for Greek, we would highly recommend following the GCSE syllabus no matter what, because that gives you unadapted text and it gives you the sort of resources you'd still need. So John Taylor would have the Greek GCSE reader, which will give you the sort of guidance you need. The Latin GCSE textbook like the readers, not a textbook, will also give you the unadapted Latin plus a lot of guidance at the back. This will give you the confidence you need to start tackling texts on your own, regardless of whether you take the exam or not. After you do that, as I mentioned earlier, use a commentary while you're reading your Latin text. This will just help you with the context. If you get lost, that will be the scaffolding you will need. And that takes us about to the end of our session. If we move on to the next slide, we'll have a QR code with all of the resources we've mentioned with the ISBN codes. We'll also put the link to the Google Doc in the chat. And here are emails if you have any questions or want any guidance for a homeschooler, or if you're self-studying yourself, we're more than happy to help. We dealt with it ourselves. We know how to offer a bit of help if you need it. And we would like to hand the rest of the time over to Q&A.
Thank you so much. That is so much information. I think what I'm going to do now is stop the recording so that we can just have a kind of free discussion. And I just want to, before I stop the recording, say thank you again for all of this wonderful information.